Hi, this is Dr. Smiley and welcome to the 5-Minute Focus. Today we are going to be learning about the biological topic of cell membranes and ion transport. So let's go ahead and put all distractions aside and get started. Remember, you can pause the video at any time, especially if it helps in the learning process. In order to discuss how things move across the cell membrane, we first must review the cell membrane itself. The cell membrane separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell, but that's not its only function. Cell membranes are semi-permeable, meaning that some materials can easily cross the membrane, while others have a lot of difficulty. The function of the cell membrane is to restrict and regulate materials that enter and exit the cell. This allows the inside of the cell to differ from the outside of the cell. Cell membranes include three major components: phospholipids, proteins, and cholesterol. So let's magnify the surface of the cell and take a look at these structures in a little bit more detail. Phospholipids in the cell membrane are oriented into what's called a bilayer. From the prefix here, you should know that this is two layers of phospholipids. Let's look at a single phospholipid in a little bit more detail. Each phospholipid is composed of a head and two tails. The head contains a phosphate group. Phosphate groups have a charge, so the head is polar. The two fatty acid tails, fatty acids are lipids, and so these are nonpolar. Therefore, the head and the tail are going to differ in affinity for water. This molecule overall is called amphipathic because it is composed of hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails. Besides phospholipids, we also have proteins in the cell membrane. Proteins can be integral, meaning that they span the membrane going from one side to the other, or they can be peripheral, meaning that they're only facing one side. Proteins have many diverse functions in the cell membrane. Our focus here will be transport. The movement of different substances across the membrane is referred to as transport. Here we consider two types of transport, active and passive. Active transport is going to require energy in the form of ATP, while passive can occur without the input of ATP. Examples of active transport include protein pumps, such as the sodium-potassium ATPase, endocytosis and exocytosis, which require a pinching of the cell membrane. Examples of passive transport, again no energy required, include simple diffusion, including osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Now let's consider how several different molecules might move across the cell membrane. How easily different molecules move across is going to be determined by how they interact with the phospholipids, which, if you remember, have polar heads and nonpolar tails. Oxygen in the form of O2 is a small nonpolar molecule. Therefore, it is going to be able to move directly across the membrane. We call this process simple diffusion. Next, we have water. Water is small, but it is polar. Therefore, the nonpolar tails are going to give it some trouble moving across the membrane directly. Because of its small size, water will trickle across the membrane by a process called simple diffusion that was used by oxygen. However, because of its polarity, this rate of movement is not going to be enough to meet the cell's demands for water. Therefore, water must also move through protein channels by a process called facilitated diffusion. Next, let's consider ions, or charged molecules. Despite their small size, because of the full charge, positive or negative, ions cannot move directly across the membrane by simple diffusion. The nonpolar tails will not let them cross this barrier. Therefore, ions must move through protein channels, integral proteins in the membrane, by the process of facilitated diffusion. The same is going to be true for glucose. Glucose, although it is only polar, is a very large molecule. Therefore, glucose must also move by facilitated diffusion or by other processes such as endocytosis and exocytosis. All the types of transport that we considered here are passive, or no energy required. Passive transport processes are really important when you want to move a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Molecules will move down their own concentration gradient until the concentration is equal on the two sides of that semipermeable membrane. But what if we want to move a molecule from low to high? Well, that would require active transport and the investment of ATP. This is the case with the sodium-potassium pump. When a cell is at rest, sodium concentrations on the inside of the cell are high with respect to the outside of the cell, while potassium concentrations are high outside the cell with respect to inside the cell. So in order to move potassium in and sodium out, we need to invest energy. In the case of the sodium-potassium pump, 3 sodium enter the protein pump, which then has a shape change that is triggered by the hydrolysis of ATP into ADP and inorganic phosphate. This causes the protein to open up to the exterior of the cell, where the 3 sodium ions are released in the external environment. At that point, 2 potassium ions then enter to and bind to the protein pump, which then, as it loses the inorganic phosphate, has another shape change and releases the 2 potassium to the inside of the cell. The end result here of the sodium-potassium pump is that we use ATP to move 3 sodium outside the cell and 2 potassium inside the cell. All of this is done against the concentration gradients of these 2 ions. Pretty fantastic. That concludes our topic of cellular transport. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon. Bye-bye.